Hey, Scott Jordan and Mark Warner here for the Thursday, September 17th COVID video update. And I'm not in my office. And I like to tell people I'm at the Four Seasons, but I'm really not.
Well, it's hard to tell you're not in your office there. That could be one of those backdrops that you pull off of Zoom.
Yeah, I'm just going to lay back on my bed here and take it easy. Go ahead, Mark. You run the rest of the program. I'll just watch. Okay, so let me give a fast update. Then we're going to get into some really good stuff. So allocations, we've gotten releases on allocations from some of our suppliers last week. Your sales associates should have contacted you, or you contact them about additional concentrated quats that are available. So things are starting to loosen up. It's funny, we get the same story from each of the major companies about there's a big boat coming from somewhere that's coming to the U.S. with whatever it is that they need to be able to make more quat and stuff like that. So it's starting to loosen up. Sprayers, we have a huge supply of sprayers coming in, hopefully in a week or so. I talked about that last week. So things are looking really good. We also have some new label updates. Our product Eric 75 and Potent AB now has a 1 minute dwell time, 1 minute. And we're anticipating our spray and go will have a revised dwell time, probably going to be a minute, if not lower than that. But that's all good news, right, Mark?
Yeah, that's all good news. And it's all related to our previous COVID-19 update where we talked about the fact that they have created a different targeted pathogen.
Yep.
So these kill claims aren't necessarily kill claims that are brand new. What they are existing kill claims that have always been on Eric 75 and Potent AB. Yep. But because the targeted pathogen has been shifted, we can use the kill claims on the rhinovirus and rotavirus.
Yep.
Instead of having to focus on more difficult to kill things like poliovirus, because as we all know, SARS-CoV-2 is relatively easy to kill.
Yeah. So if you see announcements out there that some product now has the COVID-2 on their label, it's the same, like we said last week, it's the same exact product that they had a week before. They just got their label update, and it's coming to almost every product that's on the end list will have their label updated as the EPA digs through. I think there's 400 and some products on the end list right now. So obviously it's going to take EPA a long time to get through all those.
Well, we've updated our, we have a flyer that we've created that talks about current EPA changes. So one of the challenges here that everybody needs to think about is that once the EPA does things like that at a federal level, labels have to be changed at the manufacturing end, and each state has to be dealt with. And so that can be a process that takes several months. So we have created a flyer that talks about these new changes with the EPA, and it does now reflect the 1 minute kill time on Eric 75 and the Potent AB, and fully expect that we're going to have the spray and go show up within a week maybe. And so that flyer will get changed again. So we're using that as a supplemental flyer when we send out information about our disinfectants.
Yeah, so that'll be below where this video is going to be posted.
Oh, that's what that meant? Okay.
Yeah, that's what that meant. It's going to be right down there.
I thought you were saying, all right, Mark, like, shh. All right.
Okay, well, let's get into some interesting stuff. We thought maybe we'd go kind of geeky this week and kind of delve into both some geeky stuff as well as the FAQs that we get. As you can imagine, we get a lot of questions from we get questions from end users, from distributors on all kinds of things. So we thought we'd kind of go through those. Since we're getting the questions, that means probably you have the same questions, the people watching out there. So one of the ones that comes up a lot is about skin exposure as it relates to different disinfectants. So Mark, you're our geeky expert here. So I'm gonna throw some questions at you, and then that's you. That's right. I'm gonna throw some questions at you, and let's see how you do. And I'll either say yay or nay depending upon what your answer is.
Well, that sounds fair enough. And in reality, a lot of the questions that I suspect you're tossing at me have potentially a very long technical explanation. So For the purpose of the COVID-19 update, what we're going to try to do is answer questions more conversationally in the way that a distributor sales rep might get posed with a question and the way that can be answered conversationally.
Yep. Okay. So what's the concern about skin exposure? That because we get a question, some people are saying, some of our competitors or other companies are saying that the quats are really, really dangerous. You got to watch out.
Well, it's kind of interesting that that's being said, and sometimes we have to step back and take a look at the bigger picture. So this is a little bit of a history lesson, but back in the day, the early disinfectants, they were actually founded by Joseph Lister, who took a derivative of carbolic acid and converted it into something called a phenolic. Yeah. And that was one of the early disinfectants that was used to kill microorganisms, disease-causing microorganisms. Yeah. However, and phenolics were dominant within the healthcare industry. Yeah. They, obviously bleach has been around forever. So phenolics came along as a scientific breakthrough, as a way to effectively deal with these disease-causing microorganisms. And the problem was that it had a really, really nasty, sharp smell to it. And some of us, if we're old enough or we talk to our parents, they can talk about the smells that hospitals had and that doctors' offices had many, many years ago. The real negative of phenolics didn't have to do with the smell. It had to do with that they were so corrosive. Yeah. I mean, phenolics could literally corrode stainless steel. They were documented as causing skin depigmentation. Yep. In people, and they ended up ultimately getting forbidden for use in neonatal wards in hospitals due to something called Kawasaki syndrome, which is a spontaneous death of an infant in a neonatal facility. So some of the early disinfectants were pretty darn aggressive, and what came along was this new approach of going after disinfection in a non-corrosive, much lower level of toxicity approach, and these were called quaternary ammoniums. And in the early days when these were being introduced, Scott, people were like, oh, how can this work? It doesn't stink, it doesn't eat the metal, it doesn't burn me, how can this really work? And it boils down to the fact that the way quats work is very, very different than some of these other corrosive and somewhat toxic disinfectant active agents that have been around for a long time. Those worked by corroding the cell, literally attacking it the way a flamethrower would. Yeah. Whereas quats, what they do is they actually get inside the cell and they interfere with the cell's ability to process nutrition, which interferes with its ability to reproduce, which in essence causes the colony of bacteria to die. And it's much the same way we deal with ants or roaches or some other pest problem. We don't walk around hitting them with flamethrowers, although that would work, but what we do is we put down ant bait, and ant bait's got borax in it, and they ingest the borax, and it interferes with their ability to process nutrients and to reproduce, and it causes the ant colony to die. And it's safe around babies and children and kids and everything else. So quats came along as being a very modern approach to lessening the dangers of corrosivity and definitely lessening the issues regarding toxicity. Now, my final point is that 100% active quat, like raw material 100%, would be toxic. So would hydrogen peroxide at 100%. It would blow up. Yep. But you buy hydrogen peroxide as a dental rinse at the drugstore, and you use it safely on maybe cold sores or gum infections. And the same thing can be said about quats. At 100% level concentrate, hell yeah, you want to run from that. But the reality of it is, and that's what people are bringing up all the time, like, wow, I see these warnings about quats, what's real? The reality of it is that quats are in products at such a low percentage of the ingredients. In many cases, 1%, 2%, 3%, and there might be one or two of those quats in a disinfectant concentrate. And then that is later, if it's a concentrate, mixed with 64 parts water.
Yeah.
So the amount of active quat that is actually being broadcast into a facility is so negligible. It's why it is looked at as one of the safer ways to do things rather than being something to be concerned about with toxicity. Now, where all this comes up, Scott, as you and I know, is that people are walking in just spraying over and over and over and over again all day long, every single day. And we really need to bring up the point that that is not considered to be a best practice.
Right.
The best practice is where you do a wipe down first to remove any visible soil, which may include sticky deposits from previous sprayings. You've got to get rid of this visible soil before you respray it. If that's done, there's no buildup. There's no buildup of stickiness. There's no buildup of soil. There's no buildup of potential toxicity. The other end of best practices of disinfection is not just to pre-clean the area and then apply the disinfectant, but you could, if you wanted to do a food processing area or a surface where somebody had heavy skin contact, you could actually, instead of letting it air dry after the dwell time, you could wipe up the slurry. That's going to reduce any kind of residue that would cause a stickiness or toxicity. And then the other step, which is required by law on surfaces that are disinfected where food is prepared, you got to rinse it in those instances. And so it's always been considered somewhat of a best practice if you're dealing with a surface area that you want to be safe for skin contact or food contact, or even you want it to look shiny instead of dull and smeary.
Yeah.
You take a trigger bottle with water, you spray it on a cloth, and you give it a quick wipe down, and all of a sudden all the glass is spotless, the chrome is spotless and gleaming, and so is the stainless steel. Yeah. That's why that's called a best practice. It's not required by law in most instances, but if you want to know how to do this at the best possible level, that's considered best practice.
Yeah, I like to equate it with no rinse strippers, which sounds really good, but most people don't know that the no rinse stripping is usually specific to the alkalinity of the stripper, not that, oh, by the way, you don't have to rinse after you've stripped, because, I mean, why would you leave all that crap on your floor? It's kind of like you're saying that we've used a couple times is you don't want to be just spraying dirt, right? Yep. So you got to do all those different steps. So that's great. Hopefully that clarifies things for people. So another question we get a lot is, what's with this parts per million thing, and why? What does it mean, and why does it matter?
That is a great question. I've been getting hit with that question a lot too. Yeah. And although there's a very, very technical formula that is used that allows you, like,
we'll post that down below again. We'll post that.
Okay. So essentially what it boils down to is identifying the quats that are in the product, and that's right on the label by law. And these are quaternary ammoniums, and they can be recognized just by the big long names they have. Yeah. So you can look at what is the percentage of those quaternary ammoniums in this solution, whether it's concentrate or ready to use. In many cases, that level of concentration is going to be represented by 1%, 2%, 3%. There may be one, there may be two, it might be a dual quat, or there could be more. But you add up all of those and you come up with an idea of what is the base level percentage of this solution that is actually an active agent. There's a formula you plug that all into, and when it comes out the other end of the formula, it'll come out with a number that tells you what are the parts per million. Really good disinfectant concentrate, when diluted at 2 ounces per gallon, which is 64 parts water, 1 part disinfectant, that's pretty solid dilution. Yeah. They'll come out of the other end of that pipeline at somewhere around a 600 to 700 parts per million. So let's explain how all this makes sense. Oh, by the way, Scott, RX75 being a ready-to-use product, if you do the math on that one, it'll come out at somewhere around 2,000 at the other end. So it is very high. But here's where all this is very, very relevant, is that based on the definition of disinfection, disinfected surface can only be accomplished if the parts per million exceed 300. And actually, if you read up about it, it's a gray zone. It's 300 to 350 parts per million. It has to be above that level for it to be effectively performing a disinfection on the surface. So all these disinfectants are produced to have a safety margin.
Yeah, right.
That's why it's produced at 600 or 700. It's more than twice in some cases what the minimum level is required to make a disinfection claim, and that's 300 to 350. Now, the reason for that is that disinfectants, although coming out at one end at 600 or 700 or more, that's wonderful, but they can be compromised. Mm-hmm. They can be compromised by hard water. Yeah, if the water hardness is around 400 grains, that can compromise the effectiveness of a disinfectant. That's why that safety margin is important. There are other things that come into play too. If you're using a cotton wipe can cause something called quat binding, and that can reduce the number of active parts per million that are available to fight the bad guys, the disease-causing bacteria and viruses. On the other hand, there's other fibers that are used within wipes that have come to that we've come to realize also have a negative effect on quat. It's not quat binding, which is due to cotton, but things like cellulose can actually have also the same effect. It can reduce the amount of parts per million. So here's where all that comes into play. That's why they're built at 2 times the minimum level. Here's my biggest concern though, Scott, is item number 4, and that is called microbial load. The microbial load that's involved can actually tie up the active ingredients and reduce the amount available. So let's look at it this way. The amount of reduction of microbial load can have on quat is for about every square foot that you mop clean and you bring the mop back to the bucket. For every square foot you do that, you're bringing down the parts per million on average about a half a part per million, 0.5 parts per million. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but let's take it into a bigger picture. Everybody has heard about best practices in hospitals where you do 3 patient rooms and then you dump the bucket. Even though the solution looks clean, the suds look white, it looks like it ought to be working just fine, but we're not dealing with visible soil. We're dealing with invisible soil, microbial, pathogenic microorganisms. So what's happening is I do a 300 square foot patient room. I bring the mop back and I put it in the bucket. That bucket started off at, let's say, 600 to 650 parts per million. Now that it's exposed to what I've brought up off the floor with the mop and put into this bucket to rinse it out, it's now dropped down to 450. Can I go into the second room at 450? Oh, hell yes. 450 is above 300. So I go into the second room and I mop clean that room.
Yep.
Great. That's disinfected. I come back out. The mop's been immersed in the bucket and rinsed out. And now I've dropped the parts per million in the bucket down to that threshold, 300. Can I go into the third room? Well, yes, 300 is that minimum level. So now I can do my third room. And that third room is disinfected. Now I'm bringing the mop back to the bucket and it is down now to 150. Although I'm looking at the bucket, water looks clean, the suds look white. I might be inclined to just do another room. And I see this happens all the time in K through 12 schools where they go from room to room down a hallway and they don't change the solution in the bucket until it's visibly soiled, which is way past the point of where the disinfectant has been inactivated. So if I go into room 4 with that bucket because the solution looks good, I can make it look clean because I can still pick up dirt. But I've only attacked it with an active level of 150 parts per million. By the way, Scott, 300 is the threshold for disinfection. 200 to 300 is the threshold level we look at for sanitizing. So if I'm going in there at 150, what am I actually doing? Well, I'm making it look clean. I'm putting on a show for people because they think I'm disinfecting it. But as a matter of fact, I am leaving behind scores and scores of pathogenic microorganisms that aren't being fully disinfected. And that is the big difference between disinfection, sanitizing, and just something that is potentially antimicrobial.
Perfect segue into our last question, and we're running out of time, so we're going to make this brief. So what's wrong with sanitizing versus disinfecting? What's the difference? I see all these products out there in the consumer market, they're all talking about sanitizing. They're killing 99.9%. I mean, hey, what's the difference, Mark? Come on.
It sounds like we're splitting hairs, but we're really not. I
Right.
mean, in theory, a million pathogenic microorganisms can exist on the head of this pin. Ask anybody in healthcare, they'll tell you that's a fact.
Yeah.
There could be a million right there. And if I'm not killing all of them, I'm leaving some of them behind. So we're not dealing with, we're dealing with such massive numbers in bacteria colonies or viral load that we have to go after all of it. So let's take a really sharp look at this real quick.
Yeah.
Cleaning alone, does that do anything? Yes. Does that go after bacteria? Yes.
Yep.
Cleaning is assumed to have about a 90% what's called efficacy, which means you can go after about 90% of all the germs that are there just by cleaning. But if there's a million in that area, how many am I leaving behind if I'm only doing 90%? I'm leaving 10% of them behind. That's a ton of bacteria. So we then look at getting into 99.9 or whatever, and that's what's called sanitizing. Sanitizing is doing 99.9. You see it on household products. It'll say we kill 99.9% of household germs, whatever. Yep. And now sanitizing is 99.9 up to something called a 5-log reduction, which is 99.999. Essentially 5 nines in there with a decimal wedged in. But so a log 5, a log 3 is 99.9, 3 nines, decimal plugged in there. A log 5 is 5 nines with decimal in there, 99.999. That sounds pretty damn thorough. But in reality, if I do 99.999 on the million bacteria on the end of this pin, I'm still leaving behind 10. Now, 10 doesn't sound like a lot till you figure that's a quarter square inch. That's 40 per square inch.
Yeah.
That's 5,000 per square foot. That's 50,000 for 10 square feet, which is where they're preparing food, right? So there is some being left behind. Now, the health departments have determined that to be a reduction to somewhat of a safe level in and around food production. But the reality of it is when we've got SARS-CoV-2 out there, it's not good enough, not when we can do better. So disinfection is going to the next level. It's called a 6-log reduction. That's 99.9999. 6 nines with a decimal plugged in there. Now, that is as close as we can get to 100% using random surveying rather than studying every time we use a disinfectant.
Right.
So the way that is done is that manufacturers like the Bullen companies and others have to submit documentation to the EPA that in a 5% blood serum in a Petri dish, they put an organism in it, they put the disinfectant in there, and they've checked it 10 minutes later or 2 minutes later or 1 minute later to make sure that nothing lived. And they do that with 30 different Petri dishes, and they do that 3 times or more. So it's over 100 tests that are done on one organism, and that's done for every single organism on the label, which means there's thousands of tests that have to be submitted. And in no instance, zero, Scott, 0 instance, can anything survive a disinfectant. But we can't call it 100%. We can only call it a 99.9999. Now, disinfectants are going after disease-causing microorganisms. That's what this is about. There's another term that gets thrown around a lot. That's called sterilization. Now, sterilization is a log 6 reduction of all microorganisms, good and bad. Now, we're not trying to get rid of the good ones. The good ones are actually helping us. So that's not a relevant claim when we're cleaning and sanitizing a building. But the disinfection claim is entirely relevant. And I hope that explanation helps folks to understand maybe how to explain this to folks, that there's a serious difference when somebody says to you, Scott, well, you know, if I just disinfect it, is that actually more effective than thoroughly sanitizing my room? And you'll be able to say, hell yes, it is. Disinfection is always more effective than sanitizing.
From a business standpoint, if you're looking at it from an operational standpoint, the cost difference between what you were talking about, a disinfectant and a sanitizing product, is pretty close. There's not a huge difference. The main expense is the labor in performing the tasks that you just talked about. So if you're going to bother to put the time and effort into the labor part of it to do the job, why not do it with a product that is going to be more effective in the end run because it's a better product as far as its germ killing? Why bother do the job with an inferior product if there's not that big of a difference from a cost standpoint?
Well, there is a caveat to all of this, and that is that disinfection generally can only be accomplished on non-porous surfaces.
Right.
So like desktops, countertops, handrails, stainless steel, and so on. When we're dealing with porous surfaces like textiles, like upholstery, like carpeting, or your skin, which is porous, in some cases, the strongest claim we can possibly make is a sanitizing claim because it's porous.
Yeah.
So where sanitizing is an appropriate claim is on porous surfaces, but non-porous surfaces can be disinfected, and I see no reason to excuse not fully disinfecting a non-porous surface.
Yep. Good. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed this week's geek out on disinfecting, and thanks, Mark. Obviously, you're very passionate about the subject and you know a lot. So we'll continue this segment in future shows just because we get the calls. Those of you that are looking at the video, you get the calls as well. So hopefully we're going to keep you up to date with what's going on as far as COVID and the changes and everything else, but also trying to educate people a little bit more because, first, we started out this thing not even knowing what a dwell time was. Now we're really getting into parts per million and everything else. It's not an easy thing to do the job properly.
Well, I'm glad we had the opportunity to kind of share all this. I have these conversations often with folks, and you put me on the spot and you're asking me to kind of make a very executive summary of something very, very technical. And so that's what we attempted to do. We thought it might be helpful. But obviously, as Scott said, somewhere there is going to be a link that allows you to get to the formulas. And obviously, Bullen's approach to what we do is all about education.
Yeah.
It's the belief that if somebody has a deeper level of education, it makes us look better in their eyes as being a source of a quality product and quality education. And we find that not only does that win people over, but it creates a very, very loyal customer and client base. And so our intention is to continue the education process forever. So we hope this has been helpful.
Forever? That's a long time. Okay, well, with that said, forever. I can't get mine on quite as readily as you, but hang on, I'm coming.
Well, you're at Bullen East.
I'm at Bullen East, yeah, in my own little spot here, so I don't have to worry too much. But thanks everybody for tuning in, and that's this week's COVID video update. Mark, stay safe out there, and everybody enjoy the fall. The leaves are going to start falling if you're in that part of the world. But see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.